right, let's talk about Nehemiah 5, talk about finishing chapter 5 and getting into chapter 6. Wow, so much has already happened in these chapters that we've done, 5 chapters. So let's set the stage. We've been building the wall, and there was this interruption. All of chapter 5 is an interruption, and we're still in that interruption. So chapter 4 was conflict. Chapter 3 is building, chapter 4 is conflict that's going on with the enemies on the outside, and then we stop and Nehemiah comes in and addresses an outcry. He answers a great outcry of injustice of the people that's happening inside. And so last week what we saw was the injustice was that people, nobles and rulers inside of the Jewish people were charging exorbitant amounts of interest and taking advantage of the poor people because of the famine, because of different circumstances and situations. And these people cried out, and Nehemiah confronted them and said, "What are you doing? This is totally against God's law." And so the people received this. This was how we ended it last week, that the people received this correction. And I just thought it was a good feeling. That's what I get out of that part of chapter 5 is they're like, we're not going to do it anymore. And that somehow they feel good about it. It's like when you have something wrong in your life and you realize it was wrong and you make the effort to do that turn away from that which is wrong and to right the wrong, do right, turn from wrong, it all feels good. And that's where I think it's at. And so Nehemiah then, this is a somewhat of a switch off of the focus of them, and he focuses on himself for a minute. And so what we're seeing tonight is some contrast. We're going to contrast Nehemiah's justice and their injustice, Nehemiah's leadership and the previous leaders, and then we're going to contrast relentlessness and resoluteness between the enemy's relentless and God's man is resolute or consistent. Those are the biggest takeaways that I've got from this. There's so much there that I don't think we'll be able to finish chapter 6, but we're going to jump in. So we're going to do the last 5 verses of Nehemiah 5, and this is Nehemiah. And I feel like I'm going to read and interrupt myself. I do have notes, but I feel like the word is so rich as we're talking it. But I will read this. So, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor of the land of Judah, from the 12th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provision. All right, what is important here is that he's giving a time frame. So we know that his first term, in this time that he was appointed as governor, he was there for 12 years. And this is, I don't know if we see this again, maybe, but this is his first term, and later on in chapter 13, we'll see that he has a second term. But this is how we know that he didn't just come in and build a wall and leave. He became their governor. And so he's saying, and he's talking about this, so he's sort of interrupting. This is Nehemiah telling the story, and this is him telling the story after it happened. So this is things that are happening. So if he says, I was there from 12 years, he's going back and telling the story. And so that's how we know it's from him telling it, but he's going backwards to tell it. So he says during this whole time, because at this point, he's not been there for 12 years. So, but at this time, he's saying the whole time, the whole 12 years that I was working for the governor, I did not eat from the governor's provisions. All right, and maybe I should keep going. It's hard to know to interrupt myself or not. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took them bread and wine besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. Indeed, I also continued the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work. And at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came from the nations around us. Verse 18, now that which was prepared daily, on a daily basis, was 1 ox, 6 choice sheep. Also, fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wines. Yet, in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provision because the bondage was heavy on the people. Remember me. This is how he ends this chapter. Remember me, my God, for good according to all that I've done for this people. All right, so again, this is a big contrast. He's contrasting himself with these former rulers, but I would also say that if we think about last week's focus was on injustice and how God does not like injustice, and injustice was happening to the people of God. And so here we see that Nehemiah is full of justice, that Nehemiah is full of compassion. So we see why. 2 reasons right off the bat. One is, and we see this in verse 15, because of the fear of God. Because of the fear of God. He cared more about not grieving God than the people. Injustice was wrong in the eyes of God, and he did not want to do anything unjust because he served a just God. All right, and we've seen Nehemiah's character, his leadership, his ideas of his relationship with God all along. The next thing we see in verse 18, he says, yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provision because the bondage was heavy on the people. Again, the whole reason that these people were being taken advantage of was because the people, the rulers and the nobles were giving these high interest rates, but the people had got into a bad place because of the rubble, because the whole nation was destroyed, and it was a big nation, and now it's just a remnant of people trying to run a whole city that was full of people before. So there's not as many people there to do the work. There's rubble all around them that needs to be cleaned up. They're in debt. So you can see it's just a lot of different things going on, whether it was a famine, an economic downturn, depression, however you want to say it, they were in a bad way. And paying this tribute, any amount, was going to be a burden. And Nehemiah couldn't do it. He didn't have that kind of desire for stuff as much as he had for helping God's people. Remember, again, he's give up everything that he had in the palace with the king to come here and do this. And one person said, this is a labor of love. This is nothing but a labor of love. All right, so let me explain this a little bit. He had the right to the king's provision. And we could look at this, and what we could say is that the king or the king's authority would set in place how much he was allowed to have. However, it wasn't coming from the king's treasury now. It was coming from the people. So the king could say, you get 40 shekels of silver, and you get such and such amount of food, and this is what you're allowed to have. But the people paid it. And so it was a burden on the people. And so this is where Nehemiah is getting this. He knew he could get it. He knew he had a right to these provisions. And I'm going to interrupt myself right there, and I'm going to say this reminds me completely of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 9. And I'm not going to read all of that, but that whole chapter is about Paul coming and saying, don't I have a right to this? Don't I have a right to be paid for the gospel? And he's saying, am I the only apostle? Or Barnabas and I, are we the only apostles? Peter and all these different apostles, they bring their wives along, they get paid, but are we the only one that can't have a wife and can't get paid? And he starts giving, in this chapter in 2 Corinthians 9, he starts giving word of God from the Old Testament that, you shall not muzzle an ox from treading grain, meaning that the ox is doing the work, and that you have to be able to give that ox grain. And he says, is it the ox that God is necessarily concerned about? No, God's concerned about us and what is right. Now, the thing that is different with Apostle Paul was he boasted in not taking it. To me, he was a stubborn man that says, I'm not taking it. His heart was right. His reason, he had a heart of love. Paul cared more about Jesus and the gospel being spread than anything else. And so he was planting churches, multiplying churches, and these places where he was planting churches, they were not established churches that were able to pay him a salary. So he was a tent maker, and that's in different places in the New Testament. So he was more determined that he was going to plant more churches and write more books of the Bible than he was to receive a salary. And so he he worked day and night in order to do this. And so here we have Nehemiah that is working constantly and working to build the people of God, the house of God, restore the worship. And it's the same type of mentality that he has, that he doesn't want to take from the people. He can. But then here's the contrast, and he doesn't name the governors, but in verse 15 he says, "But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them." Okay, who were the previous governors? He does not name them. We know that Zerubbabel was many years ago, and that there's this big break of no leadership, and here comes Nehemiah. And so whoever, there must have been some governors here and there that did this, but evidently this was a vacant position because Nehemiah was able to go and be the governor without any issue. I would think that if there was a governor in place that was doing a great job, the king would say, well, I've got so-and-so, Johnny's over there running Judah, I don't think I need you. So that's just my opinion there. There's a lot of things left for us to kind of surmise, and we have to be careful with that. At any rate, whoever it was, it doesn't matter. What it matters is that there were governors that were taking a larger amount of people and putting the burden. And then he doesn't stop there. He said even their servants. So they had people working. The governors had servants that were taking advantage of the people. And so this is a contrast. All my servants. So he's saying this is what they did, and this is what I'm doing. Now, why is he doing this? This is important to grasp. These people had not witnessed real leadership. Now, if you go back and you look at it, this has been 100 years, more than 100 years. We've had so many years. This generation did not have a king or have a good king in place. And I would say that the king, why did they go into exile or, be captured by the Babylonians in the first place and then taken over by the Persians, but because of a breakdown in the leadership. Okay, so they didn't have this leadership, and there was this break. So these people had not seen a real leadership that was right and just and godly and fair and cared about the people. They needed to see godly leadership. Sanballat was around, and there were other leaders that they could see, but not godly leadership. And so they needed to see what was real leadership. And even as we're studying this, we see that there were priests and there were people in place. And we're going to get into this, that they did not have the right intentions. They didn't have the right actions. They were bribed. There's things that had gone wrong that Nehemiah is trying to correct. So that is another contrast on why they needed to see what does a real leader look like, and how does a real leader respond to conflict, and how does a real leader treat the people. Another thing is he says that in all of this, he said, I feared God, and he said, I continue to work on the wall. So all of this time, and it wasn't 12 years, but all of this time I continued to work on the wall. I could have been sitting in a lap of luxury, having food brought to me, and leading and telling people what to do, and I chose to work on the wall. And he even says that his servants gathered to work on the wall. So even the people in his own household, the servants that he had, and we don't know how many, but we do know that this daily there was 150 Jews and rulers that came to his table, besides the ones that came from other nations and dignitaries. So, and again, part of this right here is talking about the 12 years that he's there. So he's trying to stress it to his readers in the middle of talking to his people here. All right, so he's telling the story himself. It's firsthand. He said, all my servants gathered to work. And he said, the amount that he makes sure to say, this is how much. We had an ox every day, 6 sheep and fowl. We had all of this that we ate. It wasn't like, I just sacrificed an ox every week, or, we ate leftovers. No, there was a lot, and he gave up. Now, he had to have some type of salary. And I can compare this to probably like you have a salary and a work expense, a hospitality or a food allowance. And I compare this to my brother-in-law, who's not my brother-in-law now, but I remember many years ago, he worked for a company and his whole job was entertaining people. It's like, what are you doing? He'd go golfing, one day he'd be golfing and one day he'd be going to dinner somewhere, and we're like, why do you get to do this while you're at work? And he explained to us that this was his job, that he was building relationships with people outside of the work that they wanted to have accounts with. And so he would take them and create these relationships. So he had a certain amount, he got his salary, but he didn't pay for those lunches and those golf things and these different things that he did with these men or women, whoever. That came out of a credit card, a food allowance, if you will, a hospitality account. And that's what we can kind of look like it with Nehemiah. He had a salary and he had a choice that he could have the people pay for what he was doing, or he could take it out of his own provision. And that's what he chose to do. And maybe he had lots of money set aside from being at the king, and he made lots of money when he was working as the cupbearer. We don't know that part, but we do know that he did not take this food allowance, and he did not demand the governor's provision because the bondage of the people were heavy. All right, so that's some good notes right there. I'm trying to look real quick to see if I've missed anything, because that is such good stuff that I don't want to miss it. Again, it's contrasting his injustice and him giving them a picture of godly leadership, and they so desperately needed it. It did, and with listing out what they were doing, it gave the magnitude of his sacrifice. It wasn't something small. And I would also say this is a challenge to poor structure. And I say that because that's part of the work I'm doing for my dissertation, is about the structure in a church and how that affects everything. And this is leadership structure, the poor leadership structure added to all of this, that there was a breakdown. And I wanted to just kind of throw this in there, that we talk about Ezra, and was Ezra the governor, and Jack Hayford, in his book, he said he surmised that probably Ezra was a spiritual reformer for about a year and then became a private citizen. And I would say that's probably right on, just because I know that Jack Hayford does a lot of research before he writes a book. But it makes more sense because he was a preacher, and I've said that before, and I keep saying that but I don't think that he was in the place of being that governor. We know that. All right. Okay, so let's move on, and we're going to contrast, and here we go. At the end of chapter 5, we're going right back into the conflict. We're going right back into building the wall. So all of that was necessary in order for the rebuilding to continue, in order for the people of God to move forward. They had to take care of those issues, and Nehemiah is trying desperately to show them the love of God and show them who God is, and just that he's always giving for us his. Nehemiah was always concerned about the people and the image of God being portrayed, and that is the Holy Spirit denying. I believe that the Holy Spirit denies his own identity to give us an identity, and that was another thing in my notes, was just talking about the identity that we have, that Nehemiah, that he's changing their mindset. You think about it. What was the people's mindset when he first came, and what is the mindset now? And I just think, yeah, they're overwhelmed, and they have all this coming at them, and they got into a place of crying out to Nehemiah. But I believe there's a shift taking place, and if you don't see it now, we're going to see it by the end of chapter 6. It's amazing. There's a shift that's beginning to happen. The enemy says that the people will never get fixed, that things will never get big, and this discouragement will plague the people, or plague us, because of the enemy says this. But then there begins to be a shift in our life, that we have in our life, that we think we're never going to climb out of this rubble. Things are never going to be different. I'm never going to overcome this, or I'm never going to accomplish this. And what happens is that we begin to live in our given authority. We begin to recognize it. And we recognize our identity. And I've said this and I'll keep saying that Nehemiah was working to give identity. The Holy Spirit is working in the people to give us an identity as a people of God with hope and strength to make a difference. And he also, in that poor structure, he's giving structure now as a leadership, and he is giving them a sense of community, purpose, unity, identity, and vision. He's giving them all that. All of that is taking place in spite of what the enemy has done, in spite of the injustices. This is all happening. And here's another thing that I talk about is urgency. When you're talking about leadership and creating change, they create a sense of urgency. And some people, authors of different textbooks, have argued that you have to create that. And I think there's a fine line of creating a sense of urgency and creating panic in people. You don't want to say, we have to do this, we have to do this. And Nehemiah had found that balance, that this needs to be done, and it can be done. And that's what he's done, and that's what we need to have. That's my opinion, that in my life, I have to have a sense of urgency that something has to get done, or I'll say, that can wait. If I don't have any sense of urgency that this needs to be completed, or an understanding that this needs to be done now, I need to finish this or finish that before I move on to this, then there's a sense of, we'll do it when it happens, and sometimes that never happens. And so that's what he has done, and that's what they continue to do. They continue to have this sense of urgency. All right, as we move into chapter 6, we're contrasting relentless enemy, consistent Nehemiah. And I'm going to give you a quote from Hitler that I feel like kind of shows how the enemy is working in this chapter. Hitler said, mental confusion, contradiction of feeling, indecisiveness, and panic. These are our weapons. Wow. And we know that he was a huge enemy. All right, so I don't have as many notes for this chapter. We'll see how far we get on that. Okay, and I think what I want to do is kind of read, talk, and then come back to my points, because there's so much here that the Word of God really speaks for itself. It's not like reading and so work beside so like we did in chapter 3. That was brutal. All right, verse 1. Now it happened. Remember, we're making a shift. We're going back to building now. So now it happened when Sanballat and Tobiah Geshem, the Arabs and the rest of our enemies, heard that I had rebuilt the wall, that there were no breaks left in it. Wow, there's no breaks left in it. They have made so much progress, though at the time I had not hung the doors in the gates. And this is why I want to stop while I'm reading this, because I don't want to miss this. And right there, this is saying we've got all the wall and there's no breaks in it. And so the enemy is seeing how much progress that they're making, Nehemiah and the people, that they're making all this progress, and they're desperate. They've got to do something before they are closed out forever. And so that's why it's ramped up, and that's why they create a conspiracy. That's the heading of this chapter, a conspiracy against Nehemiah. And here's what I don't want to miss, and that's why I stopped myself. They said that they did not have the doors hung inside the gates. So there's huge gates, and then they have doors inside the gates. And, I would love to see that in real life. And so these gates, what do doors represent? Doors represent access. So if they don't have, you understand, the enemy is just wanting, even if it's a little space. They got the wall, they got the gates, they just don't have these doors hung. And so that's a smaller space, and it's not wide open anymore, but they still want to have access, because even if you just have a little bit of access, the enemy has a crack to get in. He's going to come in and take it. And so this is why they're so desperate. And it's they're together, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of the enemy. So it's not just one person. They're coming together still. They're still united for their cause to come against Nehemiah. So there's no breaks in the wall. That says a lot. Then in that verse 2, that Sanballat, Geshem sent to me. They didn't even come to him. They sent word to him saying, come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me harm. All right, so Nehemiah recognizes their intent. He has discernment. He's a wise leader. And here's what it is. They're pretending. Let's have a conference. Let's have a truce. Let's have a peace treaty, whatever you want to call it. You can say it from the tops of a governmental system to have a peace treaty, or you just have somebody that's your enemy that's pretending that they want to come together and work things out. It all sounds good. It sounds like what the enemy would do. Let's work this out. Come on, let's, we got to do something. We got to come together and work this out. And it didn't work. That's the beautiful part of it. They sent word to him, come, let us meet together. And also they're saying in the plains of, oh no, let's get you away from where you're at. Let's pull you away from your safety. Let's meet in the alley. Let's meet, you get what I'm saying. Let's meet out here where nobody can see us and we can kill you kind of thing. And so he said, let's meet out here in the middle of nowhere, away from where you're at, away from what you're doing. And he knew that they would do him harm. All right, so Nehemiah says, I sent messengers to them saying, I'm doing a great work. And he doesn't say, I'm doing a work. He's saying, I'm doing a great work. He recognizes what he's doing is important. He recognizes the call in his life. He recognizes the importance, the value. He has confidence in what he's doing, and he's not coming down from it. So he said, so I cannot come down. I can't come down from the wall. I'm working on this wall. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be resolute. I'm going to be consistent. And he said, and I answered, why should I work it? And I love that he says, why should I leave? Because it almost feels like you're sitting there next to him and he's like, well, why would I leave? It's almost like nonsense to him. Well, why should the work cease while I leave and go down to you? As if to say, that doesn't even make sense. I'm not even playing into your games. I'm not even playing into this hypocrisy. And Nehemiah is strong and resolute in what he's doing. He's consistent. And they sent this message 4 times, and I answered them in the same manner. Consistent, 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 consistent. So he came back with them. And I wanted to point this out that, I kind of put it in my notes. Before, he would not talk to the enemy. He wouldn't address the enemy. He didn't give him the time of day. And we've talked about sometimes how you don't address the enemy. He's still not speaking directly to the enemy. And so I said, why is he even giving them an answer? And I would say that there must have been a reason that he felt the need, or else he wouldn't have. He's still not giving in to them. He's not giving them anything. He's not cowering. He's not compromising. He's giving them nothing. But there's people coming to him and saying this. And so he is answering the people. It's an answer to him through them. And it may have been very important for these people to see how he was responding. So nevertheless, he gives a response for their sake, but he's not giving the enemy what he wants. So I thought that was important to say. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before, and this is the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says, and Geshem was a high official, remember, says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. We had these type of threats early on in chapter 4. And here we go again. Except now it's a conspiracy. Now there's letter. Now there's more. It's more ramped up. And he says, no, and he says there is, I'm sorry. Verse 7 says, and you also appointed prophets. They're accusing Nehemiah. You also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, there's a king in Judah. Therefore, let us consult together. So they're saying, now this matter is going to be reported to the king. You're saying that you want to be king. You've sent out all of these things. They're making all of this up. They're saying, this is what's going on, that you've made prophets say this. I get scooted away from the desk. You have prophets that are saying that you're going to be king, and that's what you're going to do. And we're going to tell the king. So come, therefore, let us consult together. They're saying, we're going to tell the king if you don't consult with us. And the open letter means that it is open to everyone. It's made public. Anybody can read this, and it is a conspiracy, and it looks real. It can look real. But Nehemiah knew that the truth always comes out. And I don't know if you've ever been a part of a conspiracy at work, but I have on several occasions, and God has always, and I mean always, come back around and made the truth come out. Okay, but most people would probably be scared. I'll be honest. Most people would probably be scared at this point. Are you going to tell my beloved king? Are you going to that I have to do something? And Nehemiah, this is his answer. In verse 8, this is his response. His resolute, consistent answer is, then I sent to him. He's sending someone again. He's still not getting down and going. He says, no such things as you say are being done, for you invent them in your own heart. For they were trying to make us afraid, saying their hands will be weakened in their work, and it will not be done. Therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. All right. So his reply, I'll just kind of say that again. His reply was, no such thing as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. Then he comes back and explains to you and I, they're just trying to make us afraid. They're trying to make the people afraid, and their hands will be weakened. That the enemy is saying their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. And that's what they were saying. And Nehemiah comes back and he prays. Now, God, strengthen my hands. I have to keep doing this. God, strengthen my hands. You see what they're doing. It's one of those quick prayers, but I'm going to keep working. And I don't know if that's a good place to stop or not, but let me just kind of throw in some things right there before we go any further. Basically, I want to make the point that any word that God gives you, a prophetic word or something in your heart, when it is given to you, that word will be tested. And I've seen this over and over and over in my life because I've got a lot of good things from God. And you get to a point sometimes where you say, I'm not sure I want another prophetic word, because you know that the enemy's going to come against it. You know that it's going to be, can you really stand it? Can you really hold on until it happens? And sometimes it takes years. And Nehemiah, whether he realized this or not, he lived it out, that he knew that this word of God was for him to go. He knew that this is what he was called to do. He knew that this was his purpose. He knew that God was with him. And so whether that word was tested and the enemy come against him, he knew he was going to keep going. And again, the enemies were not successful. The people were successful. But the enemy didn't want to see them do any more. We also have a tendency that when we have a victory, that we kind of relax and we don't always realize that the enemy's attacking. Nehemiah doesn't seem to miss a beat. He seems to stay on guard, even though you would think he's got to this place that there's no breaks in the wall, and he might think, oh, they see that we've got the wall built. We're just working on the finishing touches. They'll leave us alone. At any rate, he is prepared and he doesn't stop working. He just keeps going with what he's tasked with. All right, so Sanballat had failed miserably to stop the people, and he is focusing on discrediting, destroying Nehemiah. And we see this over and over and over and over in the house of God, with the people of God. It is just so grievous how leaders, well-known public figures, fall. And I would think that the numbers are more for these leaders that are on TV or influencers or well-known or evangelists traveling, whatever the case may be, the ones that are well-known, that's who's going to attack them. And how many men of God have fell because of a woman or an indiscretion of some kind like that. I remember Billy Graham said he never traveled alone, that he always made sure somebody was with him because he never wanted to be that man that fell. And so that is the plan of Sanballat now, is to cause a discrediting and to destroy the leader. The discouragement, the intimidation, the fear, all of this hasn't worked, so he continues to go on. But Nehemiah is very strong, and the next thing we're going to see at the end of this chapter is two perceptions. And I think that's where we're going to stop tonight, because I just want to say that the enemy, 4 times the letter came, he was relentless. Nehemiah was consistent. The open letter was that he made it public, and that, just that there was a shift taking place. I think that's what the important thing is, that there's a shift beginning to take place. And as that shift takes place in our life, sometimes the enemy ramps things up, and that enemy coming at us is not an indication that we're doing wrong. Sometimes the enemy coming at us so strong is because an indication that we're doing something right, and he wants to stop that which we're doing right so that we can go back to the rubble that we lived in before. So that's the last thought I'll leave you with. Be blessed, and I'll see you next week.